Right. Right. W.H. Auden. He's also known with his full name, Weston Hugh Auden. He was born on 21st February 1907 in fact, please remember that we are into um, American and Afro-American themes. Okay, we are looking into the Afro-American themes. And he was born on 21st February 1907 in Yorkshire, England, and grew up in and near Birmingham, where he lived with his middle-class family. He studied English at Christ Church, Oxford, and he also has interest in German language. Okay, and then from 1930 to 1945, he used to teach in various places. Right. And moving on to the next slide. His earlier work considered poems by Auden in 1930 with the help of T.S. Eliot and the orators in 1932. Between 1935 to 1938, he wrote three plays in collaboration with Christopher Isherwood and Louis MacNeice, and these plays built his reputation as left-wing political writer. Just before World War II broke out, Auden left this place and moved to United States, where he met the poet Chester Kalman, who became his lifelong lover. Now, he won Pulitzer Prize for poetry for his long poem, The Age of Anxiety, in 1948, and this title becomes a phrase which describes the modern era and mental situation of modern people. He published The Dyer's Hand and other essays in a collection in 1962, which includes the lectures, his lectures too. Right. Now, the poem which is prescribed for this, for our syllabus is The Unknown Citizen. So, The Unknown Citizen, written by W.H. Auden, highlights the role of the individual and the increasingly anonymous bureaucracy that can arise in any country. And the tone of the poem is impersonal and clinical. The speaker, a suited bureaucrat, expresses the detached view of the state. The unknown citizen is reduced to a mere number, a series of letters. There is no name, no birthplace, or mention of loved ones. So it's both satirical and disturbing, written by Auden, and it highlights the role of the individual and the increasingly faceless bureaucracy that can arise in any country with any type of government, be it left wing or right wing. The tone of the poem is impersonal and clinical, the speaker more than likely a suited bureaucrat expressing the detached view of the state. Now, it's clear from the first 5 lines that the state is in total control and has planned and structured this individual's life in order to create a complete conformist. The state even called him a saint because he kept to the straight and narrow and was a good role model, not because he was holy or carried out religious acts. He maintained the standards expected of him by those in power. He worked hard, was part of the union, but never strayed or broke the rules. And only the war interrupted his working life, which made him a popular member of the workforce. There is mention of the social psychology department, part of the state, who no doubt investigated his background when he died and found all was normal according to his mates. He bought a newspaper each day. I mean, this is what is given in the poem, The Unknown Citizen. And that is, he read the propaganda dished out by the biased press and had no adverse reactions to the advertisements in that paper. There is some sound corporate brainwashing going on here, and this citizen has one of the cleanest in the greater community. He is not a critical thinker, but a solid type of guy who you would want living next door. He keeps up with his household goods, he adheres to all societal rules, This man is an average Joe, a perfect citizen who is conditioned to routine and will never question the settled life unless the state call on him for purposes of war. So Auden's poem is a reminder of the potential dangers inherent in any system of government, in any bureaucracy, anywhere, anytime. The individual can lose their unique identity, become a non-person without a voice, without a say in how things are run. Now it's a single stanza of 29 lines. So you don't find too many stanzas. It's not divided into stanzas, okay? And it has got 29 lines, most of them long and hardly able to carry the full rhymes that form part of an unusual rhyme scheme. So this is how it goes: A B A B A D D E F F G G E H H I I J K K J L J L N N N O O. Right. Next, we are moving on to a female writer, a poet, Maya Angelou. She was an author, a poet, civil rights activist, rights activist, professor, world renowned speaker, actress, playwright, entertainer, producer, and director. And she was born on 4th April 1928 in St. Louis, Mo. Bailey Johnson and Vivian Baxter Johnson were with her parents. She had a brother by name Bailey, and Tosh Angelos was the spouse, her husband, and she had a son and also has one grandson. And she explores this worldwide dilemma in her poem Equality. So the poem by Maya Angelou, which is prescribed for us in this semester 4, is Equality, right? So now there's a kind of a dilemma in her poem Equality. With metaphors of shadows and drums, Angelou displays the everyday frustrations of the oppressed in a society that draws a blind eye. She paints the worlds of both sides, creates a clashing scenario, and expresses her thoughts in a mere three-part poem. And powerfully, the stanzas are joined together by the anaphora, equality, and I will be free. Right. Moving on to the next slide. Now, Angelo begins her poem by exploring the rosy interpretation of the world through the eyes of the blissfully ignorant. The general you she addresses is the unmoving society in which we live. By disclosing their abstinence, she makes a statement saying that this society will not silence her despite how it views her. She claims that whether I am a whisper or a shout in your ears, I will be heard. And additionally, the paradoxes of light and dark Angelo uses are meant to signify the constant battle of being seen. Right. She proceeds to paint a picture of her world, the real world, the world of a shadow. In this interpretation, she describes the challenges both she and the Black community face, affiliating herself with her people with a we. She conveys the message that we are insulted in this society for merely breathing. And please remember, again, she belongs to, and she's a poet who brings out a lot through her writing about this kind of a racial discrimination. And this is a part of an Afro-American literature. And existing, we are looked at as if we are a menace. However, she counteracts this scrutiny with the question, if I am so small compared to your superiority, how could you possibly understand? She verbalizes the African American struggle, the struggle that we as a race will burdened with for the rest of time. Right. Now, the African American experience in the United States is a complex one. And Angelo's equality portrays exactly that. Every day, the community continues to succeed. From historical figures to academic excellence, African Americans proceed to break barriers. However, the immobile views shadow the greatness that is occurring close minded individuals consistently transform movements meant to heal into controversial subjects, therefore halting change. Now, roadblocks caused by conflicts of interest are a recurring event, which is why moving towards true equality has been a long and grueling process. Now, Maya Angelou's words characterize African Americans in a positive spotlight, encouraging them to embrace the melanin in their skin. Black is beautiful, Black is powerful. African Americans deserve to feel a sense of pride when speaking of their culture. Black deserves to be celebrated. Nevertheless, this problem is still among us. So, this is in fact not meant to be a call to revolution. It's simply depicting the message of waiting. We have been here, we have said the same things over and over again. We have been wanting this one because basic human right for years, decades, centuries. So we have been protesting for our rights, fighting the fight, writing our struggles into history. And we have been here and we will keep going. Our drum is beating. When will you finally listen? So, right. Now we are moving into block 5, which talks about the Canadian poetry, Indian poetry, and Australian poetry. Right. So, can a little info about the Canadian literature, which developed slowly. I mean, it's like we need to have a peep into this Canadian, Indian, and Australian poetry of the 20th century, right? So, before that, let us just look into the Canadian literature, which developed slowly, and it began in the 17th century and achieved its distinctive character only after Canada gained independence from Britain in 1867. From the beginnings of European colonization in the 1600s until nationhood, various factors affected cultural development in the territory now known as Canada. From colonial times on, European Canadians were divided into two distinct populations, French speaking and English speaking, although many people were bilingual. And the partisanship of these two groups, coupled with large numbers of immigrants who spoke other languages, proved to be divisive in any progress toward a single national literature. By the 1960s, the Canadian literary scene had blossomed. More volumes of poetry, fiction, drama, and critical studies appeared yearly than formerly had appeared in a decade. New Canadian-owned publishing firms opened in high schools and universities. Courses in Canadian literature proliferated. Nevertheless, the literary achievement of the 20th and 21st centuries is firmly rooted in Canada's literary past. Now, most of the Canadian literature is written in English or French. Other languages in which it appears include Gaelic, German, Icelandic, Ukrainian, Yiddish, and the many languages of Canada's original inhabitants, among them Cree, Haida, Inuktitut, and Ojibwa. Right. So we, in Canadian poetry, we have the poets Margaret Atwood and Phillips Webb. Okay, so first we'll take up Margaret Atwood. And Margaret Atwood is an award-winning Canadian poet, novelist, and essayist, born to Carl and Margaret Killam Atwood on November 18th, 1939, and in Ottawa, Canada. Atwood is best known for her novels, including The Edible Woman, The Handmaid's Tale, Cat's Eye, The Blind Assassin, Oryx and Crake, The Tent, and among an array of other works. She gained recognition as one of Canada's most prominent and prolific contemporary writers. She started writing poetry at the early age of 6 years. She significantly contributed to the genres of poetry and short stories too. Her writings have appeared in a wide range of scholarly material, spanning from college and university textbooks to important literary journals and anthologies. Atwood's sense of description is one of her best talents. So this unit contains two poems of Atwood. One is The Moment and Siren Song. The poems can be seen in the light of diversity in Atwood's style and theme, where the moment seems to be more contemporary, describing the modern man and his relation with nature, whereas the Siren Song fuses myth with reality. She has made mythology as the basis of the narrative. So the main theme of this poem is nature's ownership. So the first stanza talks about nature's beauty and that humans own all of it. The second stanza changes all of this. Margaret Atwood uses personification and imagery to convey nature's rejection to the fact that humans own nature. So the poem is organized in three stanzas of 6 lines each. The first stanza sets up the narrative by making the claim about human beings' ownership of Earth. The second stanza counters the first stanza by explicating the inherent folly behind the notion of ownership. And it's a beautifully illustrated and compactly presented work, and its meaning is especially relevant for contemporary societies. The poem is organized, the first stanza sets up the narrative by making the claim about human beings' ownership of the earth. The second, again, countering the first stanza, and the final stanza qualifies the second stanza by giving reasons for why human beings cannot be owners of the planet. Now, the poem entails how the world owns humans, contrary to the belief of humans. Without nature, humans can't survive. The speaker talks about how nature has more power over humans, even though humans try to own the land beneath their feet and gain power over it. The speaker also thinks that sooner or later, nature finds a way to own humans again. The whole theme of the poem is confirmed in the last 2 lines, where it says, "You never found us. It was always the other way around." Right. Now, moving on to the next poem by Margaret Atwood, The Siren Song. Okay. Now, Siren Song is a poem by the Canadian poet and novelist Margaret Atwood, told from the perspective of a siren. What's a siren? It's a half woman, half bird creature from Greek mythology whose singing lures sailors to their deaths. Now, there were three sirens. Uh, uh, it's Agelo, Pisino, and uh, Telixop. They were all the daughters of the river god Achilles. Now, one of them played the lyre, one played the flute, and another sang. So, now legend it has it that the goddess of harvest, Demeter, and fertility They turned the sirens to half woman, half bird creatures when the three failed to rescue Demeter's daughter, Persephone, who was kidnapped by the god of the underworld, Hades. Now, the sirens then lived on a rocky island in the middle of the sea, possibly near Italy. They sang melodies so sweet that sailors passing by could not resist getting closer to them. Following the sound of music, the sailors would steer the boats towards them or jump into the water to get closer. Either way, it always ended in disaster on the rocks. Now, the poem explores the themes of vanity and seduction, stereotypes about women being helpless, and how the need to feel unique makes people vulnerable to flattery. On another level, Siren Song also examines the ways in which traditional gender expectations can trap people, pushing them to perform isolating, lonely roles. So the poem was published in Atwood's 1974 collection titled You Are Happy. So basically, a siren is a two-headed mermaid that sings a song to lure in the men and mostly sailors to their fate, which in this case it's to their death. The song seems to be a cry for help and show how unhappy the women are, but really it's just a trick. The song is used to manipulate foolish men. This shows the true power that these women have against men. So, what is the theme of this? There could be many themes to this particular poem. And never given to something you have no knowledge about, and temptation, and then you can be easily manipulated. Right. Next, moving on to Phyllis Webb. Okay. Phyllis Webb, OC, was a Canadian poet and broadcaster. Webb's poetry had diverse influences ranging from Neo-Confucianism to the field theory of composition. Developed by the Black Mountain Poets. Critics have described her collections, Naked Poems, and Wilson's Bowl as important works in contemporary Canadian literature. Now, the body of Phyllis Webb, a few more points to be added over here. Okay, Phyllis Webb, born April 8, 1927. She's a Canadian poet and a radio broadcaster. The Canadian Encyclopedia describes her as a writer of stature in Canadian letters and calls her work brilliantly crafted, formal in its energies, and humane in its concern. Born in Victoria, British Columbia, she attended the University of British Columbia and McGill University. In 1949, she ran as a candidate for the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in the British Columbia general elections. And in 1949, the youngest person to do so. Her poetry was published in 1954 in Trio, an anthology of poems by Ellie Mundell, Gail Turnbull, and Webb, published by Raymond Sosters Contact Press. In 1957, Webb won a grant that allowed her to study theater in France. Now, her writing demonstrates the development of a feminist poet who rises from the ashes of a past shaped by patriarchal perceptions of the divine and of art. Her repeated emphasis on breaking leads us to recognize the necessity of shattering outworn myths. Webb's poetry has always pursued the metaphysical, but in her later work, she redefines that pursuit, locating it firmly in a feminine mystical tradition. Now, the poetry, this poem actually, the poem called Poet, which is by Phyllis Webb, compares acceptance of the masculinist poetic vocation to submission to rape, the victim, and is a pale object swallowed by the tallest of mouth, who is yet to overcome her in a contest of wills, as I or it prevails. So the competition is fierce. This is not a vocation chosen in the pursuit of pleasure. Woman is literally effaced in this poem. The reader is also struck by the passive tone. I am promised the lack of choice, the sense of powerlessness, resignation, and the conclusion that poetry is some form of punishment or exile whereby the woman poet is confined to a runnery. The speaker of this poem writes of an ensuing sense of claustrophobia of enclosure within various confining structures. The grave, the hourglass, the walls of the nunnery, the prison cell, the chancellery, and most significant for a woman, the veil. Yet the veil simultaneously permits her one freedom, the power to observe, to remain inscrutable and protected from the unsolicited gaze. Ultimately, it allows her to play a subversive role. The veil is also an interesting metaphor because of its oblique reference to the veil of Isis, a figure who gains prominence in Webb's more recent works. Right. Now let us move on to the next poet, Henry Derozio. The poem which is written by, now we are moving into the Indian poetry in English, okay, in the 19th century, Indian poetry in English. And the famous poet of this period is Henry Derozio. And the poem which we're going to read is To India, My Native Land. So Henry Louis Vivian Derozio, the son of Indo-Portuguese father and an English mother, is considered as the first Indian poet. He first tried his hand at journalism before quitting the Hindu college as a lecturer. His fearless spirit of inquiry, indomitable courage, his reformist idealism, and his romantic enthusiasm fired the imagination of then young generation. His poetic career was short-lived. The two volumes of poetry he published are Poems and The Fakir of Janjira, a metrical tale and other poems. His successful poems are his sonnets, which show a strong influence of British poets. He was heavily influenced by the British Romantic poets in theme, sentiment, imagery, and diction, along with some traces of neoclassicism. His satirical verse, Don Juanics, and the long narrative poems indicate his special affinity with Byron. A noteworthy feature of his poetry is the burning nationalist zeal, which is somewhat phenomenal. His unmistakable authenticity of patriotic utterance is manifested in his poems To India, My Native Land, The Harp of India, and to the pupils of Hindu College. He was also a pioneer in the use of Indian myths and legends as well as Western classical myths. He was a poet, thinker, radical, and one of the earliest Indian educationists to disseminate Western learning and philosophy among the young men of Bengal, was also crucially the first modern Indian to write of the incumbent nation extensively in English. Now, this poem, To India, My Native Land, is a typical Derosian poem in its theme and style. The poem laments the degradation and devaluation of India because of her slavery to the British and seeks to regain India's lost glory and reverence. Now, this poem actually demonstrates, demonstrates his devotion to India. The poem demonstrates his devotion to India. In this poem, the author bemoans the British servitude of India and wishes she may regain her previous glory. The idea behind the poem is quite similar to that of the other poem by the same author, Harp of India. Now, throughout the stanzas, the speaker expresses their woefulness of watching the repressive forces of colonization stifle their country while still in exile. The poem goes on to emphasize the speaker a speaker's willingness to contribute to the struggle for India's independence, further emphasizing the importance of strength and solidarity in the face of oppression. So, with its ardent patriotism and everlasting love for the nation, To India, My Native Land continues to inspire generations of people. It's a timeless homage to India's rich cultural legacy, history, and spirit. Right. Next, we move on to another poem and the poet of the Indian poet, Indian poetry in English, where we are going to study about A.K. Ramanujan. Okay. And he was a poet, he was a translator, linguist, and folklorist. He was born in 1929 to a family of Tamil Brahmins in Mysore, Karnataka. Now, after his initial education in Mysore and Pune, he began his professional career as a lecturer in English in various colleges in South India. He went on to receive a PhD from Indiana University in 1963. Now, from 1962 till his death in 1993, he taught at the University of Chicago in the departments of South Asian languages and civilization and linguists, as well as the Committee on Social Thought. Ramanujan's major volumes of poetry in English include The Striders, Relations, Second Sight, posthumously The Black Hen, and his translations from classical Tamil as well as Kannada were perhaps more well known in his own lifetime. So, the poem which is prescribed and written by A.K. Ramanujan is Small Scale Reflections. Okay, Small Scale Reflections on a Great House. Right. Now, here the poem reflects the speaker's reflections on a ancestral house. The poet mentions that some things that entered the house never went out. Okay, and he talks about cattle, cow, which gets its name, which gets its mate, and shelter. Whereas library books, they also enter the house, they became breeding homes for insects and worms. Now, again, God's wedding anniversary dishes never returned. Dishes, as in the neighbors, whatever they've given, probably all these, kind of some kind of food items were given in a container. The containers never went out. They were never returned. Then there were gramophones. Then there was a son-in-law. Okay. I mean, so these are certain, he tries to project that in the poetry. Now, for example, some things that went out of the house did find their way back. I mean, they were returned again. They came back, like bales of cotton, letters, ideas returned to the house as gossip. A bigger song cock had picked. Some things that went out of his house could never stay out for a longer time, like daughters married idiots and therefore found to be incompatible. Sons of the house who had run away returned in the shape of their sons. Okay. And a nephew who had left the house to join the army returned as a dead body. So, Small Scale Reflections on a Great House by A.K. Ramanujan explores the concept of history by using a narrative filled with vivid imagery to depict a family house. The poem commences with the speaker asserting that any object that enters his dwelling invariably remains there. Right. Now we are moving into the next part of it, the Australian literature. Okay. So here for this, we have Judith Wright, the first poet. And then we have Eve to Her Daughters is a poem, and Woman to Man is another poem by Judith Wright. Okay. So here, born in Armidale, Judith Wright. So we're going to talk about Judith Wright, the biography. He was an Australian poet Born in New South Wales in 1915, throughout her career, Wright has actively involved in political campaigns and movements, including the anti-war movement, Australia's conservationist movement, and the movement to change the treatment of the country's Aboriginal people. According to the Dictionary of Literary Biography, Australian writers, Wright's first book of poetry, The Moving Image, was published in 1946. Wright's second collection, Woman to Man, was published in 1949 and was considered to be original for its frank treatment of sexuality from the female point of view. Right. Now, after early death of her mother, Wright attended New England's girls' school. Wright also studied philosophy, English, psychology, and history at the University of Sydney. Moved to Mount Tambourine, Queensland in 1950, she married Jack McKinney, philosopher and novelist. Now, Wright became completely deaf in 1992. Well known for her campaigning support for the Great Barrier Reef and Fraser Island. Advocate for the Aboriginal land rights movement. She died in Canberra on June 26th. So these are some of her major works: The Moving Image, Woman to Man, The Gateway, The Two Fires, Birds, The Other Half, Magpie's Shadow. Now, basically, these were the themes which were seen in her works: Australian environment, relationships between settlers and Australians, relationships between mankind and the environment, connections with human experience and natural world, bridging the gap between nature and man. The first poem which we're going to read is Eve to her daughters. So in the poem Eve to her daughters, the story of Adam and Eve from the book of Genesis is contemporized to underscore the continual subjugation of women in patriarchal societies across cultures and continents. The message of Eve to her daughters is categorical, that they should not make the mistake that all women have been making for ages, following men blindly very often at the expense of their individuality and dignity is a central idea discussed in the poem. So Eve wants her daughters not to be submissive, but rather to help man see that God can still exist in the face of mechanization and scientific advancement. And she speaks in this poem, she speaks freely to her female posterity concerning the circumstances of adjusting to modern earthly life and of her relationship with her husband, Adam. Adam's hubris and obsession with figuring out the mechanism of things has replaced his faith in God, and Eve examines both her own faults and the faults of her husband. Now, feminist ideas can be found in Eve to her daughters, which criticizes the destruction brought about by violence and entitlement in the modern world. This poem can be read as a call to action for modern women to participate in leadership roles and address the issues in today's world. Right. So the elaborate fable is meant to demonstrate that nothing exists except the faults of character, but Adam wouldn't accept it, for he turned himself into God who is faultless. So Judith Wright, deploying ironical tone and tenor, delineates the patriarchal hegemony and emphasizes the need that all women should resist hegemony in every sphere of human engagement. Further, the poem underscores the issue of female sensual intuition against the male mechanical logic. And next, we move on to another poem by Judith Wright, Woman to Man. So here it goes. Uh, in Woman to Man, she unveils the emotions of pregnant woman in a manner. The reader can easily realize this in the very first stanza when she says, "The eyeless laborer in the night, the selfless, shapeless seed I hold, builds for its resurrection day." So in the second stanza, Wright states that though the woman has not delivered the child yet, she does not have a name yet. Both the mother and the expectant father seem to know the child intimately. The reader can see that both the mother and the father are excited about their creation. Wright diligently delineates the risks associated with the childbirth. The poet further tries to show how pain and shock will wait in birth and later in life. Wright concludes the poem by expressing a sense of apprehensions about various aspects of mundane reality associated with the childbirth. Now, this poem is written from the point of view of a pregnant woman to acquaint the reader with the emotional turbulence that she experiences during the childbirth. Although the author does mention the father in the piece briefly, she mainly focuses on the woman's perspective. She creates a strong feminist message in the conclusion of her work. While most people, men included, believe childbirth to be a happy and exciting time for a family. And Wright shows that there are dangers along the way. She shows this when she says, "So hold me, for I am afraid." In a sense, she underscores the fact that the childbirth is a very complicated and risky along the way for her as well as the child. Wright illustrates the reality behind childbirth from the point of view of a woman. Okay, so with this, we conclude this poem, Woman to Man, right? Written by Judith Wright. And this is again a part of the Australian poetry. Right. And so here we've also understood a bit about the Australian literature, and a few features of Australian poetry have been discussed. And Judith Wright, one of the finest poets of Australian literature, has been discussed as a representative poet. Her poems, Eve to her daughters and Woman to Man, are critically analyzed. So if you compare this Australian and Canadian, you will notice that poets, I mean, their concern over humanity in general, the issues concerning humanity in general, right? So, so I think with this we complete our block 5 too. So, so any queries, any doubts? So basically, what are you supposed to be reading as for the examination point of view? First and foremost, the period or the era in which the poem we are going to read, because the period or the era is actually reflected in the poetry of those poets. Okay, so first and foremost, the background of the that period has to be read to understand the poetry in detail. Okay, and then the poets, of course, they belong to that particular period. Hence, they would definitely take those features into their writings, isn't it? So that is one point. Then again, you also have to um, uh, take up not just the background, historical background of the poem also, and the poet's biography. That is again very, very important, because poem is nothing but their own kind of expressions, isn't it? And how did they come up with? So from first block to the fifth block. So the poet's biography is very important, and you will also get to know the reason behind as to why they have taken up this kind of a poetry. Okay, for various reasons. So each poet comes up with their kind of statement, isn't it? What they've felt. For example, if you take up the Indian poetry, now Derozio, Henry Derozio, he felt, I mean, it was a kind of a patriotic poem. No, he didn't like that kind of an, the colonization, the British being, Indians being subdued by Britishers. Okay, then you have this Afro-American literature. Okay, there you see the Africans coming up with their way of writing in order to, bring down this kind of a racial discrimination. So first and foremost, the period, that is very, very important. So the poem and the poet, in which period they are coming up with this kind of a poem. Then the poet's biography, right? Then after which, I mean, the style of the poem, what kind of a poem it is. Okay, is it in the form of a sonnet? Is it in the form of an elegy, or what exactly? So, for example, "Oh Captain, My Captain," it's an elegy, right? So it's like a mournful kind of a poem where he writes about the Abraham Lincoln's, in the context of his death, right? He writes that poem. So you need to know the biography and the style of the poem, the tone of the poem, the speaker. Okay, and then you need to analyze a bit. I mean, in the to understand the poem, you should really understand whether it is written in the form of a stanza, right? And whether it is a, just a single kind of a, a passage, just like you have Robert Browning's, My Last Duchess, where it's a monologue, dramatic monologue. So what is a dramatic monologue? That kind of a feature you find it. So that you should understand. And sometimes the poem is again stanza wise, but there's no proper rhyme. Okay. Sometimes it is in a complete rhyme, but sometimes it's a free verse where there's no proper rhyming pattern over there, but still it conveys a kind of a message, right, to the readers. So basically, the um, the period, the era, the poet, biography, the poem, the structure of the poem, then the critical analysis. Okay, not just the analysis. I mean, the critically, how are you going to analyze it? I mean, how is it you are going to associate it with the poet? Okay, all that is very, very important. Then, okay, I think per unit you have two poets. Okay, except for the last, I think, where we have just one poet, the Australian, where we have Judith Wright, where has uh, given with two poems, right? So, uh, so this is how, and when you read the poem, half your problem is solved. As you read the poem, you will understand at least a gist of it. You will get a kind of an idea about it, right? Then again, get back to the summary of it. Don't read the summary first. First, read the poem. Twice you have to read the poem. Then there is a glossary. There are meanings given for the words. You just check it. And for the words which you do not know, maybe you can refer to a dictionary or so. And moreover, they are not of the contemporary English, right? Some of the poems, especially those which fall into 18th and poems which fall before that 18th century, maybe some of the words are really, I mean, not comprehensible, right? Then you can look for the dictionary and look up the dictionary for the meanings of that. Otherwise, the material itself has got the glossary where all the meanings are discussed there. So just go through it. Then what you do after reading it twice, then you sit and analyze it. Okay. Then you try to read it. You will definitely be able to understand. So poetry, in fact, the more you read it, the better it is. Then you will understand it. So it's like chewing and chewing, and then you will actually start relishing it, the taste of the poetry, right? And that's really a beautiful thing. And once you start reading it and trying to understand it, you'll fall in love with poetry. It's not like prose. Prose is like, just things which are laid on your platter. You just directly have to put it into your mouth and eat it. But poetry is something like, every time you read, you will end up getting a different a point of view of that, right? So, but whatever it is, just read it twice to understand it better, then switch on to the summary then. Okay. Then the analysis part of it. Look for the alliterations there, assonance, enjambment, okay, and the rhyming, rhythm, and the metrical pattern and the meter. Is it a iambic pentameter, trimeter, tetrameter, or whatever it is? You just have to, kind of concentrate on that part of it also, not just reading it and leaving. I mean, you should be able to figure out those literary devices, Okay, you can find personification, and you might find metaphors, similes. Okay, all such kind of things you should be able to, figure it out from that poetry. Only then you will get the pleasure of reading a poem, right? So this is in point of, I mean, in your examination point of view, I'm trying to kind of give you some tips as to how to prepare for the exam, right? So any other doubts you have? I see two students in my class today. Uh, and another student who hasn't turned up, I think so. Okay, so do you have any doubts? But one thing, you only have to read it. Unless and until you read it, you will not be able to understand the poetry. So that is very, very important. Any other doubts you have? Yeah, that's it. So can I just leave the session? I hope you all understood. My voice was audible. So today being the last session, right? Okay, fine. Thank you so much, Sumaya. So yes, all the best for your exam. So, um, well, I think you all have to prepare all the blocks, ma, all the poems, because there's nothing like, but still, uh, maybe, each poet's one poem you have to definitely touch upon, right? I can say that much. Okay, there's nothing like, and you have the model test paper at the end of the book, right? The model test paper. So basically, let me tell you, from first to five, each block is different. I mean, the first block talks about Renaissance and Elizabethan period, and then second block talks about the Victorian, and then the third block Victorian. Second, it talks about the neoclassical and Enlightenment period. So each one is unique. I mean, we had it been a repetition, probably we can just say that this might come and this may not come. But each and every block is unique, and you have to prepare all of those. Okay, just give a reading. I'm sure you'll be able to remember it. You need not by heart the answers. You just give a reading, you'll understand it, then you'll be able to write it. Okay, yes. You can develop the answers on your own. Once you understand, right? You can develop it. I mean, you can write the answers on your own. Yeah. Any other doubts? Just 5 more minutes for the thing to end up. If you don't have anything, so I'll be leaving the class now. Fine. Okay. Right. All the best. Okay. Right. I'm leaving the session now.